Heading north of Athens, I soon found myself in a rocky yet lush land of farmsteads and rural villages that the passing centuries seem to have utterly forgotten. It was in one such village, somewhere near the Macedonian border, that I was spending a few days resting, as must have been on the second or third evening, that I was spending the evening in the village pub with a bottle of wine and casually reading a book on vampire legends that I had had with me. It was then that I became aware of my table suddenly being surrounded by a group of rather nervous-looking locals. After some awkwardly translated exposition, it turned out that they believed that the spirit of some recently deceased woman was plaguing her former friends and family. Well, they were under the impression that I would know something about this, to which my reply was, "You must be joking, right?" Apparently they weren't, which was why I was woken up before dawn the next day and was shivering in the early morning cold in the local churchyard. The villagers had decked me out with crucifixes, rosary beads, holy water, and all the usual accoutrements. Why they picked me out to be some kind of vampire hunter, I'll never know. I tried to get it over with as quickly as possible. What I could recall of such things from my time studying with the order in Sweden, this just called for a little ceremony. But I did a bit of pacing about and Latin chanting for good measure, and, fortunately, to dissuade them from the idea of actually exhuming what was left of the body. Once it was all over with, I quietly gathered my bag and clothing, and left the village at some speed. Sometimes it's just best to get out of there before things get even sillier. By nightfall, I'd crossed the border into Bulgaria, and a day or so later, I made it to the town of Varna, on the coast of the Black Sea. Now, one of the things few people know about me is that thanks to a rather unorthodox education, I am, amongst other things, quite a competent sailor. And this was how I managed to talk my way onto the crew of a small yacht bound north along the coast. After several rough but enjoyable days of sailing, I left the crew and we moored in the harbour of Constantina on the Romanian coast. I jumped on a train and was quickly in the historically disputed city of Bucharest. But I was running low on funds, and I knew I couldn't stay there long. In the end, my money got me as far as a mid-sized farming community somewhere in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. Once again, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no money and only the most basic of understandings of the language, I turned to one of my childhood heroes for inspiration and asked myself, what would Lord Byron do? And to that end, I followed the only logical course of action. I seduced a farmer's daughter and convinced her to give me loan of a horse on the promise that I'd leave the beast with a family friend when I reached the nearest town with a rail station. The needs must when the devil drives, as they say. So I saddled the horse and galloped out into the barren landscape that led further into the mountains and to my next destination. The Carpathian Mountains. In centuries past, they were renowned for the stories of horror told about them. Wild and largely desolate, they stand as the easternmost border to Transylvania. And it was with this running through my mind, making my imagination work overtime, that I rode out alone. On horseback, it was the better part of a week's hard riding to the next town of any significance. Nothing like a sense of overwhelming freedom to realize just how small you are in the world. But I must say it was nicely liberating to get totally lost and away from all technology and hustle and bustle of civilization. Putting all that wilderness survival training from school to good use and sleeping under the stars, it was nice. On several nights, I saw eyes reflected in the firelight from my camp, and hints of dark shapes moving in the shadows. By the tracks I found each morning, it would seem that I was followed most of the way by some large fox-like animals, which was something of a disconcerting thought each night. As nice as it was to get in touch with nature again, I was glad when I finally reached the town I was looking for. As promised, I left the horse in the stable and boarded a train bound to the medieval mountain citadel of Sighișoara, the birthplace of Vlad Tepes, the infamous warlord more famously known as as Dracula. Despite the town's excessively bloody past, it is a beautiful place, a true pleasure to visit. It's odd to think that the same area that produced the brutal Vlad the Impaler, less than 100 miles from the citadel, was the birthplace of Elizabeth Bathory, the bloody countess, who was famed for bathing in the blood of young girls to try and stay young. Maybe it's something in the water. Before leaving Transylvania, I just had to see the sights mentioned in Bram Stoker's famous novel. I saw Vlad's old castle, the quintessential castle of dark fairy tales, high on a mountain surrounded by steep cliffs and complete with dungeons and secret passages. I took a horse-drawn carriage ride down the Burgo Pass and spent a night in the same inn as Jonathan Harker from the novel. Thankfully, the next few weeks were fairly uneventful, as I hopped trains across Hungary and Austria and once again through Tuscany, and it was while I was passing through the wine-growing regions of the south of France that I ran into a group of despondent Brits, students apparently, that had spent the past few months on some sort of quest for the Holy Grail. As this reason was about as unusual and ridiculous as my own reasons for being there, we got on fabulously. It was as we were having a few good bottles of wine together one afternoon, we hit on a last-ditch search strategy for the Grail. Someone mentioned that it could be anywhere. It could even be at the bottom of this bottle of wine, for all we know. It turned out it wasn't, but then I pointed out that there were several hundred unsearched bottles of wine left in this one pub alone, and I thought we owed it to ourselves to make one last effort to find the elusive artifact. Which is why that night was filled with repeated cries of, "Barkeep, another bottle of potential theological symbolism, if you would be so kind." When I painfully awoke the next day, it was to find that they had been kind enough to have taken me with them, and soon we were once again looking at the white cliffs of Dover. Looking back, it had been a rather odd few months, but I had made it through unscathed, and I thought I may get lucky with it next year and actually make it to the con. What a fool I was.